This is How to Win a Nerd Fight, Understanding Persuasive Writing and Speech Techniques. The goal of this presentation, as we'll discuss shortly, is to sort of understand how arguments should be framed and sort of encourage healthy and friendly and fun discussions and avoid the not friendly discussions and arguments. So I want to start this presentation with an argument. How many of you have seen Dragon Ball Z? Or at least know what Dragon Ball Z is? Okay, so most of you. Okay, well, that's good. That was probably, if we didn't have that, this would have been a disaster already. So I want to get a poll of the audience. I have a feeling I know, but I want to get a poll of the audience. Who here thinks, in terms of a better character, that Goku is the better character? Oh, wow. All right. This will be interesting, because I'm going to take the opposing side. And I'm assuming most of you assume that Vegeta is the better character? All right. All right. Well, we'll get into how we frame those arguments in terms of who can and cannot be a better character shortly. But first, I want to kind of explain who I am. You know, why is this guy randomly talking on a panel? So my name is Evan Baumel. I am a project manager for a federal subcontract, and I'm responsible for a whole bunch of people, so I have to do a lot of like negotiating and sort of arguing with people all the time. I'm a consoles department head, specifically an assistant department head. Bunny's the head honcho. I was a debate team captain of Student Congress, which was a format where you submit fake bills and you try to argue for or against them. And I once took a speech class from one of Obama's former speechwriters, one of them from the Illinois Senate. Why is that important? I don't know. I just wanted to throw that in there. But honestly, the main reason why I want to do this is I am passionate about persuasive speech and arguments, because I think that a lot of us, when we engage in arguments, either in real life or on the internet, we don't really come away from it feeling any better about either our position or the position of the person we're arguing. And we're going to try to, improve that situation or encourage healthy arguments or to avoid unhealthy arguments, things like that. So that's generally what we want to do in this panel. So what we're going to cover today is the foundation of argumentative writing and speaking to establish the goals and rules of effective arguing, the methods for structuring an argument. So I'll give you sort of like a map of how generally an argument is formed, techniques for addressing an opponent's arguments, and examples of good and bad argument activities. So if we do have time, I know that public speaking is a lot of people's fears, and there's a lot of people struggle with public speaking, and maybe if we have time or we run out of debate topics, we can kind of cover a little bit of that. But unfortunately, the reality is the best way to get better at public speaking is to speak publicly, be it, hanging out with a large group of friends or giving presentations at groups, joining a Toastmasters. Those are the main ways that you'll gain confidence. And trust me when I say, when you do have that skill, it takes you very far. So here's what we're not going to cover. So we are not going to cover general writing techniques. And as I was relating to with the public speaking side, the best way to become a better writer is to just write more and get feedback from that writing. There's a lot of writing groups out there. I'm sure you can join discords for fiction and nonfiction alike. We're going to try to avoid politics, not for various reasons. MAGFest is a nonprofit. We shouldn't really be pushing or opposing specific political parties. We're going to try to avoid specific legal discussions because the law is the law, and as much as whether you think it's just or unjust, it is. And you can argue about it, but you're not going to really gain much from this forum specifically. And we're also going to just avoid insults, slander, and any personal attacks against anyone in the room, outside the room. We want to keep it as civil as possible, and we'll cover some of the reasons why later. So sort of the key question right now is, what is an argument? So the first thing you should always do in a good debate is to pull out a dictionary and define the key phrases. An argument, according to Merriam-Webster, is a coherent series of reasons, statements, or facts intended to support or establish a point of view. And the definition I wrote before finding that out is The intent of arguing is to convince someone that your position reflects the most accurate representation of the truth. So in a non-fictional or just a real-world setting, whenever people have arguments, they're trying to convince you that what you're saying is most reflective of the real world. And you'll often engage in arguments where you think the person is completely on a different planet. So, that's the point of arguing, is to say what you're saying, from the foundation of that, I want to change that completely. Now, we're going to focus mostly on nerd fights, so in a fictional context, and the only truth in fiction is what is written, either by the show creator, the show or author, or the writing team. What is presented in writing, on screen, in forums, etc., that is from the creator is the only known truth. And the best way to think about it also is the most recent truth tends to supersede previous truths. But obviously, big series or communities that we like, that we follow, there are gaps in that truth. There are character interactions that we never see. There are elements of how that world works that aren't clearly defined. And what fans like to do is they try to fill the gaps to build the world they want. But of course, when that happens, fans may have different viewpoints of what the world should be like. So often that's the source of a lot of fan arguments is, here's what I think this world should be. No, here's what I think this world should be. So that's sort of the back and forth that we're trying to push and pull from. So hopefully we'll try to get a good understanding of how to build to a common ground. So this was something that I always use as sort of like a mental understanding of how to sort of focus on arguments. So there are two viewpoints that you have to follow. By the way, if anyone wants the slides, I'm more than happy to send them to anyone. There's no well, there are copyrights maybe being violated. But I could send it to you, on a personal level. But there are two viewpoints that you have to consider when you're in an argument. Your viewpoint and your opponent, or if it's multiple people, everyone else's. So the main argument that you're trying to present is based on several supporting points or supporting arguments to what you're trying to say. And we'll cover sort of how to build a supporting argument in a minute. But I want to kind of show the push and pull that often comes from an argument. So you'll provide your supporting arguments. Your opponent will provide their supporting arguments. And what you have to do next is to look at their supporting arguments, to listen to what they are saying, and try to find weaknesses, gaps, or contradictions in what they're trying to say, and try to oppose their supporting points. So you want to try to oppose your opponent's supporting points, and what will happen is, over time, your opponent will also oppose your supporting points. So you have to acknowledge that there may be weaknesses in what you're trying to argue. But just because someone lobs a complaint or an opposition to what you're trying to say doesn't mean that you can't oppose what they're opposing. So this is a rabbit hole that can go many, many layers deep. And by the way, I put just 4 supporting points and 2 opposing points just to kind of like provide a frame. You can have 2,000, 26. I just came up with a random number. You can have as many supporting arguments that your opponent is willing to tolerate. Because at some point, points do repeat and you want to avoid repeating yourself over and over again. Because if you have to repeat something, it doesn't necessarily make it more true. So... And when you argue, you have to remember a few things. And these are sort of rules for how to argue. First and foremost, you want to remember that your opponent's viewpoint comes from some semblance of logic. So it is ideal to understand that they are people too. And they have lives that they've led up until the moment they've met you and decided to argue with you. And that is how that informs how their argument is built. So if they come from a completely different background, or if they watched a different dub of the anime that you liked, or if there was different source material, different translations. There could be many reasons why they see the media that you like in a different context. So that's sort of understanding how that argument works. And it's also important to remember that arguments don't necessarily need to have winners and losers. You know, both of you can come to an understanding at the same point to say like, oh, you know what? You're right. And that doesn't conflict with my view at all. So it doesn't mean that if you give up a point that you've lost the entire argument. You may have won something. Who knows? This is sort of an obvious thing, but you know, it's sometimes important to remember when you do engage in an argument, you don't want to raise your voice at all. It is fun to have shouting matches with your friends about really stupid, pedantic bullshit, but it is not fun to raise your voice and leave a situation feeling both bad about the other person and bad about yourself. So it is ideal to try to keep as cool of a temperature as possible and keep things, you know, on a level head and level playing field. I acknowledged this a little bit before, but it is important to acknowledge the valid evidence from the person who is opposing you. You know, when in the arguments that we're going to have ahead, there are going to be points that I cannot dispute, and if I can't dispute it, I have to just say, you know what, you are correct, and that does weaken my argument, but I still think that the main argument I'm presenting holds weight or influences your viewpoint. And this is probably the thing that is the most underrated and is probably a good sign of whether or not you're having a healthy or respected conversation. Give your opponent equal or near equal time. If you are not giving them a lot of time, or you keep interrupting them, or if they're not giving you equal time, it's just turning into a shouting match, an argument, like an unhealthy argument. And good communication, I guess, like in relationships, relies on back and forth with almost equal weight. So that sort of are the main rules of arguments in general. So we've covered a lot of ground. I know it's been a lot. I just wanted to show you a visual representation of what it's like to argue on the internet. So we're going to cover a bit more ground in terms of framing an argument, understanding how to address an opponent's argument shortly. But I just want to ask, is there any questions so far? Yes.
You talked about an argument's goal to win. You convince somebody of the truth.
Yeah.
What about somebody whose goal is just chaos? You're looking to distract yourself.
Right. So the question for those in the recording is, this is assume these arguments and these rules generally apply to people who are interested in having a good argument. What if the goal of the person arguing is to cause chaos? Well, thankfully, it takes two to tango. So if you don't want to engage in an argument that is purely relying on chaos, there are two things you can do. One is to just try to state to whoever is in the room that you don't believe that this is a good faith argument, that this is only to this is an argument that's only purpose is to cause harm to those who try to argue against it. And the second is just to disengage. You know, if there are people who are, there's a lot of unhealthy people out there that you really maybe shouldn't spend a lot of time with. So if this is a constant feature is for them to argue in a chaotic fashion, maybe they don't respect you, and that's something to consider. So this is unfortunately, and we're going to cover this at the end, but unfortunately the reality is what I'm about to provide you can't be fully applied in the real world. But I'm going to try to convince you that the reason that these tools and understandings of how arguments are structured is helpful is so that you can identify traps to identify that someone is being chaotic in their argument. So you can say, okay, the only reason you are stating this is to cause harm. I'm not going to acknowledge that. So
I appreciate that on one setting, but what about the end by end setting? Where you have
the end by end? I'm sorry, what do you mean?
Many people that can be engaging in the conversation, the discussion, the argument.
Right. So let's go quickly back to this slide. So I guess the only way to sort of think about it is because obviously we only have room for 2 arguments on this slide, but you can just literally copy and paste that opponent's viewpoint and just multiply it throughout. And so if you're engaging in arguments with multiple people, assuming that everyone has a unique position, then you would have to address the supporting points from both sides, both different individuals. So, but most likely what happens in a group setting is people tend to fall into 2 or 3 camps. The group that is in favor of something or the group that is against something. And then there may be a third group of they don't want to be involved in this particular affair, or they don't think it's very interesting or important, or they like to cause chaos. It could be that. So, yeah. Any questions beyond that? Yes.
Sometimes when the arguments can get very emotional, and I can realize that if I start, even refuting things, even at a decent time, because he loves to take the floor for several minutes, almost like maybe even 7 or so on the play. And I'm wondering, is it good to sort of just maybe play along with them, or should we still stand your ground at certain points?
It depends on your goal. Is your goal to convince them? So the question is, when you're engaged with an individual who is very emotional and is going on for several minutes at a time, what is the strategy for how to approach that? Do you just try to feed into it and try to lead to their conclusion, then just disengage, or do you try to push and pull? And again, it depends on the goal. Are you genuinely trying to convince this person, and do you think this person is going to respect your opinion? So that's sort of the unfortunate fact is there might be people out there who really will never hear your opinion. But I think that most people in most circumstances are open. Something that you can do is, if you're in an argument, literally disengage. Say, you know what? I don't think right now in this moment we're having a healthy argument or a healthy discussion. We're going to separate for a half hour and then come back and we'll see what we do. That is incredibly helpful in all sorts of situations of like, where we are right now is not healthy. Let's just come back, either in a half hour, or however long it takes. But of course, who needs more time? That's the key issue. All right. I'll be happy to answer more questions later. I just want to kind of move on. So I wanted to, I realize I'm not on the question slide. What I wanted to do is I wanted to try to give you a model of argument, and I was trying to look up the name of the argument model that I used, and I discovered that this model is similar to what I used. It's called the Toulmin model of argument. Toulmin was a philosopher and a writer, and this is an excellent way of understanding arguments from a pure philosophical perspective. I didn't learn that. So we're going to focus on the system I did learn, which is a more simplified and more argumentative format of arguing. So some of you may have heard the system if you were in debate, the claim, warrant, impact system. It might have several names, but the structure is this. So when you make your supporting points, you have 3 parts to it. There is the claim itself, so the specific thing you are arguing. Nacho cheese is the best side dish on the planet. This character that I like from this anime is the deepest character that I've ever engaged with. That's the claim. That's the specific point you're trying to make. Usually it's in the form of a brief single sentence statement. The warrant is the actual evidence you're going to use to back up that claim. Because I can say that light is green. I can't really convince you of that without proper evidence. I would need to give you a doctor's note from your own doctor saying you're colorblind, that kind of thing. That's the thing. The warrant is the evidence you need to actually back up your claim. So it can be based on logic, it can be based on philosophy, it can be based on facts, it can be all sorts of things that your opponent must accept as valid. So in general, concrete evidence, so true data that has been collected, true events that have happened, tend to be better than assumptions, but they're not all. You might also need to rely on logic and deductive reasoning in order to make your argument more effectively. So that's sort of what you need to back up your claim. And then the impact, which is sort of an add-on claim, is just reinforcing why that claim that you made, that light is green because you're colorblind and everyone else in the room can see it as green, needs to be important for a specific reason. So I don't know where I was going with that specific thread, because if it is or isn't green, that's just a fundamental truth. But you want to try to argue why the combination of the claim and award provide a support to your main argument that was shown earlier. So that's the boring explanation of how to argue. So we're going to try to put this in practice. I'm going to try to give a pro argument in favor of our original argument that I presented at the start. Now, this is a very lopsided room, so it will be hard to argue one of these more than the other. I'm going to provide a pro argument in favor of Goku being a better character, and then I'm going to give an argument in favor of Vegeta being a better character. So the reason I think Goku is a better character than Vegeta is that Goku has proven that he is very good at building connections with the characters around him. When you look at all the opponents that Goku faces, a significant number of them not only grow to respect Goku as a fighter, but they've established relationships with him and grow to respect him or join his entourage in the broader purpose of his goal. And this trait gives him an advantage in deepening his relationship with his friends, because you get the opportunity to see people who once fought, sometimes viciously, able to connect and grow with each other. So that would be a pro argument in favor of Goku. Now I'm going to switch hats and argue for Vegeta. The reason that I think Vegeta is a better character, the reason I think Vegeta is a better character than Goku is that Vegeta is a reflection of the struggle to try to surpass those around him. So ever since he was on Earth, Vegeta has proven himself as a hungry fighter for strong opponents. And he has to challenge himself constantly just to be able to match those around him. His training when he was off planet, his training in the gravity chamber, it was all for the purpose of being the strongest character. And that's a really great narrative, not just for Vegeta as a character, but for those around him, because almost all the fighters in Dragon Ball Z are trying to grow under the guiding principles of martial arts to be the best that you can be. And that though you may not reach that goal, the effort to try to get there is what makes us better. So that would be an argument in favor of Vegeta. So that's pretty good. There's strong cases on both sides. You might think one side is a little stronger than the other, but saying strong arguments alone is not going to help you. You also have to try to counter your opponent's argument. So you can have all the strong arguments in the world, but if you do not address your opponent's points, you both just seem like you're in a deadlock. You need to be able to understand the core of what your opponent is arguing, how they are building their claims, and how they are using to either support their case or opposing yours. And it's always a good idea to examine the source of information that they use. I was once in a debate with someone in high school, and they used a source called weneedtobuildawall.com, which may or may not be the most biased source of information in the world. It's always good to check the validity, the likelihood of it being factually correct before you take their words at face value. Because if you do notice a contradiction, you can use that in your opposition. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact opposite of what I did before. I'm going to make an argument against Goku being a better character and against Vegeta being a better character. So the argument against Goku being the better character is that Goku regularly places his friends in grave danger, which undermines the argument that he's trying to build deeper relationships with his opponent, because he's on numerous occasions put Earth's fate, Universe 7's fate, several planets' fates at risk just for the sake of fighting strong opponents. And he either doesn't adequately understand or doesn't give much gravity to the idea that what he's doing could put his friend in danger. So because of that, his selfish desires and his tendency to raise the stakes force story writers to pull out literal plot points out of nowhere to give Goku the win that he needs, but it does nothing to service his character as a strong, compassionate individual. All right, so now... I'm sorry? Well, he's done that, but that was expected. But so an opposing argument for Vegeta. So this is something that I thought about, because notice that I emphasized Vegeta since he was on Earth. You don't really hear a lot about Vegeta's past and how that informs his character. And really, Goku's character starts from way back at the beginning of the anime. But Vegeta's character, or manga, Vegeta's character really only starts on Earth. And when you do get flashbacks to his past, they really don't show how it builds his character. He just is default super villain turned anti-hero. Up until Goku fights him, he just acts like a generic villain hellbent on power and violence and destruction. It's only brought up, his past is only brought up when it is relevant to the plot, like Frieza destroying his planet or Beerus embarrassing his father. So yes, his current character is a good character in some respects, but it doesn't necessarily, the elements against Vegeta in terms of the character that he was before doesn't really build him into the good, into a well representation of a bad guy to turn good persona. It just turns him into Goku's sidekick. Now, some of you may argue that point, and you could be correct, but I wanted to just give you an example of the back and forth that you'll often have to deal with when trying to provide an effective argument. So that's just sort of how it is. So this last section, and then we'll get into the fun stuff, is just sort of things to consider when you're starting a debate or engaged in a debate. Scope your argument. What I mean by that is if you are starting an argument with someone about a specific fan series, you want to try to keep it focused on that key question that you're trying to answer of like, is this character better, or does this hurt the series, or does this hurt the narrative? Because your opponent could pull evidence from fans universes you've never even heard of. So it is important to try to keep the scope of your argument limited, or if you do expand it, set separate cases. So let's say, what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought. Smart terrain, limit factors beyond examining. I think I've established this. So something that I do occasionally encourage people to do is give space to your opponent to occasionally be correct. So, for instance, who's the better character in Dragon Ball Z versus Dragon Ball Super? You can set those to be two separate arguments so that maybe Vegeta's the stronger character in Z, but it's the Goku show in Dragon Ball Super, that kind of thing. So that way you can find more common ground and try to get a better understanding of the truth that you both want to appreciate. And this sort of leads into the next slide, which is to break down the main question. Notice how I started this argument with who's the better character. What if we change the question to who's the more interesting character? I think that changing that, and I was going to say that it might sway you one way or the other, but I think all of you are pretty much swayed on one side of this particular question of who's more interesting, Goku or Vegeta. It's clearly Vegeta. But it changes the context of the question because better is a subjective term. How do you define a better character? So, but it is pretty easy to define who's a more interesting character, whose story elements are you more interested to see. So addressing and defining the main question allows you to set specific scopes much easier. So, before we get into some of the arguments, I just want to emphasize some of the common mistakes in arguments to avoid. Repeated phrases or repeating claims generally doesn't add credibility to them. Unfortunately, there is evidence online to suggest that repeating phrases in real life does convince people more. But in terms of a one-on-one, peer-to-peer argument, it really doesn't help, especially if the person says, but that's just what you said earlier. You're just saying the same thing again. Don't stay on a specific point or specific claim for too long, because what you're trying to do is provide a logical train. And if one train car is too big, it becomes a lot harder to tug the rest of the train. Make sure that every point that you provide contributes to the overall greater narrative. And the way you do that is you could just limit the amount of arguments. So in general, you only really need like 3 or 4 main points to support your main argument, and just keep them steady against opposing points. Avoid rude behaviors such as interruptions, extreme reactions, or distracting facial expressions. You often see whenever you see an argument, like I don't know if any of you saw the presidential debates, you'll see them occasionally do like. So that's fun from an entertainment perspective and pushing a narrative, but in an actual argument, it does nothing good. So try to avoid any extreme emotions. Try to listen to what they have to say. And doing things like interruptions distracts you from being able to do that. And finally, this is just simple. Don't make it personal. Who cares if I think Goku is a better character and the rest of you don't? It doesn't affect our lives in any way. I'm going to go grocery shopping next week, regardless of whether you convince me Goku or Vegeta is going to be a better character. It doesn't matter. So for things that have no weight to your life, don't try to let it affect you. And for things that you do find interesting or appealing, try to understand that everyone enjoys things differently. So this is something that I wanted to kind of showcase of a real life example of using persuasive arguments in a recent setting. I did this last month. So because I'm a project manager, I have direct supervision of some employees. And part of my responsibility is to make sure everyone's certification is, up to date and intact. And when we bring on new hires, there's like a grace period of about 3 months by default. One of my employees did not make that 3-month deadline. So what I wanted to do was argue to our customer, who's the prime contractor, that we extend the term of the deadline for his certification. And I built supporting arguments in that favor, highlighting contractual requirements, saying that it's actually 6 months, not 3 months. We just cut it in half to keep things safe. They are actively studying for the cert, so they're not just sitting on their butt. They've already failed it once, but they're going to try again. And they have already interacted with customers, and the customers like him. So that argument was sent and written in an email, sent to the boss, and the boss responded, okay. And they provided their terms to sort of enforce their narrative. But the end result is still that I got an extension from my employee. So this is sort of an example of a real life argument that took place. And even though we both agreed on the same cause, there was plenty of space for the PM that I was arguing against to push back. But we still got the result we wanted. So I hinted at this before, but the reality of what I'm telling you right now is that most of you, if not all of you, will never have this situation in a realistic, real-world setting. So why in the world did I just spend 34 of your minutes talking about this in the first place? Well, I think it's important to understand how arguments are structured, how arguments are built, where they come from, to get a good sense of understanding contrasting opinions. It's always a good idea to understand where your opponent comes from. What are they doing? Why do they have this? And if you do get into an argument next time, you'll start to be able to break down the structure of their argument. How are they arguing? What is their source? Why did they just say that right now? And how does it undermine my argument? These are very, very, very useful skills to have in the real world, especially if you interact with people on a regular basis. The back and forth push and pull of people's interactions is critical to being able to be successful in general. Plus, understanding arguments allows you to avoid misinformation. It allows you to understand when you're being fed nothing but propaganda and encourage you to think skeptically about any of the claims you're given. So that's one of the main reasons why I think that understanding persuasive arguments is important. So that's it for the main content. Any questions before we maybe engage in some debates? What's up?
What if you're trying to have an argument? What if you're trying to have a discussion with someone that turns into an argument and you really want to stay engaged because it's important and you'd like them to hopefully de-escalate to a point where it's
Yeah.
not being an argument?
Yeah. So the question for the recording is, what if you start a discussion and it turns into an argument and it doesn't? I'm assuming that the expectation is it's not going anywhere, as it turns more and more into an emotional, leaning on more of attacks than actual arguments and discussions. This is sort of similar to the question the previous gentleman asked, where you have to understand what is at stake and what the end goal of the person you're arguing against is. If you're in a situation you suddenly realize this is an argument that's not going anywhere, it's often good to disengage and say, you know what, can we maybe take like a 5-minute break and talk about this in like 5 or 10 minutes while I go get a drink of water? Just so that you can collect your thoughts, saying, what am I trying to accomplish and what are they trying to accomplish? Now, it may be that fundamentally you both are going to argue for very different outcomes, and you just have to either negotiate to a more appropriate middle ground, or if you cannot get them to agree to what you need, decide, is it worth the negative blowback that I will get to either accept or reject their argument or the discussion item or decision? You know, it ultimately comes down to breaking down the situation, understanding where you are and how you want to move forward. Yes.
What do you do when your, for lack of a better term, opponent uses a bunch of logical fallacies that are just poke so much cheese in their holes in the cheese of their argument that it's just, do you point them out? Like, if someone uses a no true Scotsman fallacy and it's just so obvious and it's like, dude.
I assume it depends on the logical fallacy, but I assume that one of the ways, there are two key ways to do it, is to force your opponent to repeat back what you understand their logic is, just so that if they miscommunicated or they realize what they just argued doesn't make sense, they can say, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. That's how they could possibly do it, assuming they're not a malicious person. But the other side is to try to apply reverse logic. So if the logical fallacy holds weight, then it should be able to apply reverse logic. So like, let's say, I believe this because I know that if this happens, this will happen, when there's no real link between the two events. So it's try to apply the reverse logic of, so what if this doesn't happen? Does this not happen? Or how does this work with this if this situation is completely absent? You know, it's like the broken window theory of like, is it the broken window or is it everything surrounding the broken window that's causing, higher crimes, this, that, and the other? So that kind of stuff. It also depends on the goal of what your opponent's trying to argue. If they are arguing with logical fallacies simply because they're trying to undermine your position for the purpose of making your life worse, then there's nothing you can really do to try to push too hard on those logical fallacies. And honestly, it requires, again, active listening and a willingness to be able to listen to your opponent, and that includes on their side. So, or force them, here's another tactic, force them to explain their logic, to say, okay, I don't understand the link between these two, please explain them. And then we can try to back it up with evidence. So that's another topic. So, yes.
evidence versus lies, a lot of times, you kind of mentioned something about where people get emotionally heated and then it kind of revolves from the argument into just a yelling match.
Yeah.
At a certain point, especially when you're dealing with like larger scenarios where the debate is being like used by more than just the individual participating, at what point do you just say, hey, one side has evidence, the other side blatantly does not? How do you convince, well, kind of anyone of that case?
Right. So for the question is, so let's say you are, well, it depends on the context of where you are in this argument or if you're even in the argument. But the question is, let's say there is an argument going on and it's very emotional and there's lots of back and forth, almost shouting, and there's other people in the room. How do you proceed in a situation like that? And I think the answer is depends. If you are the participant in that argument, you need to de-escalate as soon as possible on your side to say, like, listen, we're getting heated. I still believe what I believe, but I don't think we're going in a healthy or productive direction. Let's try to disengage. And then what you should be doing, this is getting a little bit into politicking, is to go to everyone who is in that room, either ideally in private and saying, what do you think? Like, I want to get your feedback of, who is right and who is wrong. Or not just who's right and who's wrong, just what do you think? And just be warned that in those scenarios, especially if there's a lot of emotional charge, they will default to being in favor of you, even if they may not agree to it. And the reason of that is because they are trying to avoid conflict themselves. So try to be as level-headed as possible when you're approaching a group, saying, what if, what was there anything I was arguing that was incorrect or that I should try to, reestablish and work from a more common ground? Now, if you're not a participant in that specific discussion, the only thing you can do is, if you can pick a side, don't focus on the argument itself, focus on the core of what they're trying to achieve, and then work a little in the background with the remainder of the group saying, listen, I know these two idiots are arguing like a bunch of mad chickens, but we do need to start, we need to come up with a solution or come to an agreement in some form or fashion. What do precisely what you did before, where, what do you think? It's very, very, very good to get a lot of feedback. It is a lot of work, admittedly, especially if it's more than 2 or 3 people. But if the end goal is to convince as much people as possible, that's what you got to do. I just realized there's a lot of parallels to the ongoing House Speaker debacle, to that sort of thing, except I don't think everyone in that particular discussion is arguing in good faith. But that's besides the point. All right, I'm sorry. I just said I would avoid politics, but all right. Any other questions? Yes.
This might be kind of off the wall, but in your circle of friends, colleagues, are there any folks you just come to the conclusion that, I'm just not going to debate with this person? Maybe due to personalities or a history of not debating with debate. I'm curious to see if, with your skills, if you always push through it anyways to try it, or if there's ever just like a barrier, like, no, we're done.
Well, it all will depend on the context of your friendship and depend on the context of how you want to build a relationship with that individual. I'll give you the most relevant example for me. So I work in a federal contract space, and it is highly discouraged to discuss politics in federal contracting spaces for lots of reasons. You don't know the person you're talking to, if what their political beliefs are or how they view the world. And you're all there for a common purpose, which is to support, do your job in supporting the government to accomplish its objective. So what you think about abortion, gay rights, gun rights, this, that, and the other, isn't relevant to the work you're doing. Now, in terms of friendships, yes, you will have friends that believe some kooky stuff. And I have friends that believe in some kooky stuff or do kooky things. And especially if they're on different aisles of the different political aisles, the way you approach them is generally to be as non-combative as possible. And honestly, the best solution for encouraging a person to be on your side is to keep spending time with them. I know that a lot of the narrative in the past 5 to 10 years of politicking has been to try, to cancel, to avoid people who have awful, terrible opinions, this, that, and the other. And a lot of it online is very valid because we don't want to promote people who are doing awful things. But from a personal level, you do have to kind of swallow the pain pill a little bit and just accept that this is who they are right now. Maybe they'll change, maybe they won't. And that's sort of the reality that you got to deal with. But they're more likely to change if they're around people like you. So that got shockingly deep and personal. I like that. Thank you. All right. Anything else? Or do we want to maybe encourage arguments in favor or against any of the questions we're looking at here? All right. Oh, sorry. Did you have?
Just one little controversial question, but was Fire Emblem too intense for this list? Because I thought that might have been one of the biggest ones to be on.
I'm sorry. What was the question?
Was Fire Emblem, maybe 3 Houses was a bit too much for this list?
Fire Emblem. Oh, Fire Emblem 3 Houses, of like whether it's good or bad, or?
Well, like just topics involved in games. I think those are like heavily debated for like years on that.
Oh, in terms of like which house is probably most accurate or representative of what of the narrative that should be built, so here's the problem with a lot of here's the problem with a lot of RPGs. Bad RPGs, or at least mediocre RPGs, will like make it abundantly clear who's the bad guy. Or they'll make it clear that the bad guy is pretending to be the good guy, but it's incredibly obvious that they're the bad guy. So I think depending on which game you play, maybe Fire Emblem does a good job of subverting that. Maybe it doesn't. I've never played it. So I actually haven't played a Fire Emblem game. So I don't know. Yes.
Anime people are more degens.
Oh, yes. So, yes. So, all right. So how about, I want to hear arguments. So let's have a pretend debate. I want to hear arguments in favor of who's more degenerate, anime or gaming. Let's start with arguments in favor of anime. Yes. Oh, no. So.
Okay. 3 reasons why anime has the most degens.
Gonna turn, sorry. Well, I'm just gonna see if this,
All right, I'll talk loud.
all right, sure.
Reason why otaku or anime fans are more degens. 1, hug pillows. We all know they're not just for hugging. Everybody knows. 2, the different type of cons. That's not as in anime cons, but as in shoujo cons, loli cons, and other
Oh, yeah. Okay.
And 3, people who say animes and mangas and don't understand that anime and manga is plural already. You don't need to add this.
All right, so let's break down the arguments that were just presented. So, first of all, the first argument was that the hug pillows. So that is a good argument in terms of establishing the narrative that a lot of these people engage in a lot of really self-destructive activities. Though I could counter that with the idea of, what if you just want a pillow? What if it's just comfortable just to have like a dakimakura with nothing on it? Obviously, having your favorite character in a dakimakura is a little odd, accepted, but odd. But what if that's what provides you comfort? There are people find comfort in different ways. So it's entirely possible that the effort of getting a dakimakura may be a way of avoiding degeneracy and avoiding self-destructive behavior. The second point was, I'm sorry? Oh, the cons. Oh, yes. So that is a very strong point. The fact that anime highlights and pushes a lot of very disturbing content and behavior. And that's a hard argument to push back against, and is probably one of the core arguments of the idea of an anime being a degenerate. And the only counter to that I can think of is that you're going to encounter that whether you're with anime or not. But the counter to that argument would be, yes, but anime exposes that to a lot more people and may push people into more self-destructive behaviors. So, and then the third argument was animes and mangas. I would argue that's not exactly within the scope of like which is more degenerate, because I could say them Nintendos, and it would not provide credence to one side or the other. But I still think that, you know, they
Plastic for lulz.
yeah, I know, it's fine. But that's the whole point of like I'm taking something very unserious and turning it semi-serious. So that's sort of the way of pushing and pulling that. So anyone else want to take a shot or a side on any of the questions we got? Or do you want to
I'd like to make I would actually argue gaming is more degenerate.
All right, sure, go ahead.
Okay, I think the most obvious example can be summed up in one word: Gamergate.
Oh, nice. Excellent.
Because at least anime fans don't really dox people that they disagree with, or
Well, that's not 100% true, but yes. Well, actually, this is an excellent example of one of the rules I was mentioning earlier. Try not to interrupt the opponent, so go ahead and proceed.
oh, okay, yes. Also, not necessarily the culture that has some of the most undesirable aspects, like sexism, especially, and also like chauvinism, wasn't entirely because of a lot of developers that push a lot of those narratives and aesthetic choices, but it doesn't cast a pretty good light on that community.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that not all A's are B's, but it's very significant and visible.
Yeah. So the way I would I would break down what you just described into two or three structures. The first, of course, being that gaming as a culture encourages a lot of really toxic behavior, such as doxing, sexism, all that. I mean, just play League and play not absolutely superb, and you'll see prime examples of that. And that is a cultural element that is reinforced within gaming itself. You know, the bad talking on mic. You know, the insulting people when they do bad by calling them a scrub. You could argue that there is some of that in anime too, but I do think it is stronger in gaming. What was the second? There was another part, not just of the sexism and all that stuff.
What I was saying before is that I'm not saying that all developers are guilty of putting a lot of
Oh, yes.
chauvinism and misogynistic imagery and content in their games, but it's very visible.
Yes. So this is a very strong point to make in terms of reinforcing the previous claim that you made of how gaming culture reinforces it. And then you can go even further beyond saying, yeah, it's not just bad fans, it's bad developers too. Highlighting the fact that, and here's your warrant, early on in gaming, back before there was a gaming culture, gaming was played by both men and women. Arcades were very popular entertainment spots, but as consoles became more mainstream and video games became more mainstream, it started skewing more and more and more male-oriented. And then because of that, the advertisements, the development decisions that took place in especially the late 80s and 90s reinforced that to the point of it being completely almost toxic to women and other non-male individuals. So thankfully we are starting to turn away from that, but it still is a very, very big problem. Though I would also argue anime has almost the same problem in terms of its chauvinism, sexism, by the fact that most of the manga authors are male and depict women with very large breasts and put them in very suggestive situations for the contrivance of the audience's pleasure. So obviously there's push and pull on both sides, but the fact that both sides have that as a strength is an argument in favor of both of them being degenerate. So, yeah. And then the end goal of that discussion might be that, yeah, maybe we aren't doing the healthiest things in the world. So, I've been given the close to 5-minute warning, so we can maybe do one more topic or one more discussion item, and then we're going to have to wrap it up. Let's do both of you. Yeah, you first, and then you.
I was gonna just kind of pose my own question. Is Cloud Strife in Final Fantasy VII a war criminal?
Ooh, interesting. Is Cloud Strife a war criminal? I mean, it depends on what perspective you're coming from. Because Shinra, before he left, would have absolutely argued against that argument, saying, no, absolutely not. He's working to protect the people of Midgar and all the surrounding regions who are under Shinra's protection. But after he left, Shinra would absolutely make the argument that this man's a terrorist. They literally call the group he's a part of terrorists in the game. And maybe the actions that he doesn't certainly justify him as like a angelic character. No, Sephiroth has that down pat. But you can argue that the fact that he was an active soldier for, well, maybe, soldier for Shinra and then turned against them gives him a lot of complexity and depth. So you can argue both sides very easily, though maybe leaning towards war criminal. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, you hear me?
Yes, but speak up a little.
I was going to say that Game of Thrones is definitely still worth a rewatch, considering the ending, because they leave you enough seeds and clues and foreshadows to what the ending will be. So it really wasn't that surprising if you're paying attention to what the groundwork that they had built from the beginning to the end. And if you were caught off guard, then maybe you might have been paying attention, and you should even rewatch it even more.
Okay, so the question was in reference to what I wrote just as like impromptu thing. Is it still worth watching Game of Thrones given the ending? And the argument given is yes, actually, because you can rewatch the series knowing the ending and look at the hints that lead to the ultimate ending that occurred, as disappointing to some as it may have been, because at least it gives you a reason to sort of understand, wait, why was that the ending? So, plus, you get to see a lot of naked people, so that's fun. All right, anything else? I think we're good on terms of discussion items and questions. Well, any other questions before we close?
So for that topic, culturally, the decade that was the best, I go with the 80s because that was the precedent set decade. Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, Friday the 13th. What do they all have in common? That's why they got their start. 40 years later, we're still talking about them. They still producing content, merchandise, etc.
Yeah, I mean, the argument given is that in terms of which is the best decade culturally, that the 80s was the golden age of horror and the horror movies that we still talk about today. Although I can also give the argument against that, which is if you don't care about horror, there might not be much of you for the 80s. But, it's still a strong point. All right, I know you had a question.
I guess to circle back to the gaming versus anime degeneratism issue, I'm going to put one last in for gaming because of things we've previously heard here, in that both sides have horrible boogeyman issues. They use boogeymen on both sides. Oh, it's the gamergators. Oh, it's these people that got magic weaving degrees and are now interloping in our thing because they can't get jobs elsewhere. And we use these straw people to enable ourselves to be as nasty as possible because, oh, they're just NPCs, they're enemies, there's no point. And that eventually creates a culture of, it's okay because they are the enemy.
Yeah, I mean, so to highlight for the recording, to emphasize that both gaming and anime provide straw men for for a lot of the issues they see in their medium, and because of that, it encourages a lot of awful and toxic and harassing behavior on that part. So it is a subject that is certainly a strong argument in favor. And in arguing these things, going back to what I said earlier, you do find that sometimes the truth that you get is not whether or not gaming or anime is more degenerate. It's just like, what are the behaviors that we should try to call out in all fandoms to try to make our world a more positive and better place? And I think that's the truth that we might get out of this sort of discussion.
Actually, yeah, perhaps it's more in the sense of like
Yeah.
a more classical logical argument where we both present ideas to find a greater truth.
Yeah, and maybe there is no greater truth, but at least we got closer to a broad range of truths through this discussion. All right, so that's it for me. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope all of you have a wonderful MAGFest. Come down to Expo Hall A for the consoles department shortly. It may not be open yet, but it will be soon. And play some awesome games, y'all. Rock on!